on Math Chats. Today we will be covering back mapping for skill retention. I want to remind you that this opportunity is being made available to you through the partnership between DPI and your local North Dakota REAs. It's being recorded in order to make it available as an asynchronous format for those that are unable to join us live today. So sit back and let's talk about the next step in what we should be doing for our students. There's 3 steps involved in back mapping and planning for retention. And the different steps start with identifying what the priority standard needs to be. And then the next part moves into working on what back map skills, what do the kids come to the class not knowing at grade level in order to be able to do grade level standards. There's things that they should have mastered prior to that often makes them difficult to be successful in the work that we're doing. And then we have to purposefully plan for retention once we have a chance to back map and reteach those prerequisite skills as well as the skill that we're working on at grade level. If you've attended our chats prior to this one, you've seen our instructional hierarchy from Pennsylvania Mathematics. It does a nice job of showing where the different areas of math proficiency are happening at. Most of our new skills are taught at the proficiency level or at the acquisition level, and then we move into the proficiency level. And once they've gained proficiency, they're able to apply and gain mastery by doing a number of different adaptation and generalization activities in order to maintain and build their mastery of that skill further. When we look at that next part of the instructional hierarchy, we can think of it as that acquisition stage being the frustrational range, that next stage of proficiency, the instructional range, and finally, once they reach mastery, we can provide them with a number of different activities and problems in order to apply their skills. And the colored lines show us how, as performance increases and fluency is gained and students move into mastery, we can expect their number of errors to decrease, but more importantly, we can expect them to get more fluent and proficient. We have used the gradual release model of teaching in the past sessions to help outline what it might look like in these different areas of math skills acquisition. And we're going to talk about and refer to this a little bit more as we go on. It's also in your handout so that you have it for further reference as you think about how you're going to build and improve retention in your classroom. This slide shows the way that the guided practice model is superimposed over those 3 areas of math learning. The explicit modeling is where we spend most of our time when we're in that first acquisition area and moving into guided practice where both the student and the teacher are working together. And then as we go into proficiency, we have the guided practice as we slowly release them into independent practice. When we go one step further and put in this where we would think about where does back mapping, reteaching those prerequisite skills, and retention of grade level practice occur, it occurs all along the continuum. It depends on what area of the back mapping we are working in. Why should we back map? We need to increase mastery of skill levels. The bottom line is many of our students do not come to us having the skills that they need in order to be successful at the grade level skills that we want them to be able to do. And so we need to look at the importance of spaced and interleaved practice opportunities as we move from one area to the next. Let's look back at that rate of forgetting that we looked at earlier on in one of the sessions. Herman Ebbinghaus identified for us what happens if we don't revisit a number of skills in mathematics, and not just in math, but in pretty much every subject. When we teach it that first time, and if we teach it to fluency and they have 100% retention, we have to realize that if we are not revisiting that skill, they're slowly going to lose it and they're going to lose mastery of that skill every time we go further and further out from the actual assessment of that skill. On the bottom of the graph, you notice that there's a 7-day repetition, a 31-day repetition, and a 3-month repetition. And the most recent research shows that those spacings have to be very purposeful in order to really build mastery and let the brain connect and grasp and retain in order to retrieve that information. This picture does a nice job of demonstrating by the time a child gets to kindergarten, they can pay attention to only 2 or 3 things at once. As they continue through school and even as adults, we're only able to pay attention to 3 or 4 things at once. Back mapping spreads the reteaching mastery of prerequisite skills over time, and it improves the student's ability to focus on the grade level material if they have that other stuff mastered to automaticity. When we're skill mapping, the first thing we need to do is to identify grade level priority standards that we're going to use for year-long focus. These skills, we want to make sure that they're imperative to how the students are going to be successful when they go on to the next level, whether that's the next grade level or whether it's out of the classroom door and working on something outside. When a student is given a math problem in real life, they don't have a whole bunch of teaching or block practice that occurs ahead of time. So what we're going to do first is take a look at what are the possible data resources and what can I use as reliable resources to identify these skills for my classroom. I want to think about what are the skills the students most need in order to be successful as they go on to the next level, the next grade level mastery or grade level mastery standards. I also, if I'm not sure, I can always ask the teacher of the grade level above me because they will definitely tell me what are the students coming in that they're not remembering that's really hindering them from being able to do the standards at grade level. Now, let's take a look quickly at how I might do this. Well, if I go to the North Dakota standards, on the North Dakota Standards-Based Learning site, the link is up here for further reference for you to link on, and it is live inside the PDF that you have available to you on the hub. I want to look at what are the priority standards that the state has identified for me, or perhaps you have your own school standards that have been identified. What are the standards that would be most important to our students in order to go to the next grade level? Today, we're going to use standard from the 4th grade number and operations, number base 10, number 5, as our example as we work through this process. Now, I don't want to just look at one place. Another place I might want to look is at our North Dakota State assessment data. And when I pull up my North Dakota State assessment information in 4th grade, the 4th grade NBT 5 standard is listed as being one of the standards that was assessed. I can look at the difference between how did my district do compared to the state, but more importantly, I can look at these 2 columns to see how are we doing. I can look if my students are showing that they're proficient at the NBT 5 standard. You can see that our district is partially proficient, but they are not proficient. One classroom is doing fairly well. The other one isn't quite there yet. So what does that mean as I dig further into the data? It also tells me whether it's a weak or a strong area for our students. And what does that look like? Well, it tells me again that it's an area of strength, but I realize that that's only because we're doing a little better than the state and not necessarily great as a district. Another place I might look is at the Achieve the Core coherence mapping. The Achieve the Core coherence mapping is only done in math, but it provides us with some really good information on what are the standards that most support math achievement in Algebra 1. The bottom line is Algebra 1 is the gatekeeper of all math classes. If our students can't be successful at Algebra 1 on their own, and rather that we have to drag them through Algebra 1, we know that they're probably not going to be very successful at the next level. So I'm going to take you there just so that you can see what this means. If I go to the site Achieve the Core Coherence Map, the link is in the PDF, but you can also just type that into the browser and go into coherence mapping. I'm going to get started because I've already worked through the background information that they will give you if you want to do to it. I'm going to go to the standard that we've been talking about, 4th grade, number and operations, NBT standard 5. Well, the great news is it shows up because they only list in here the standards that they feel are absolutely necessary for success in algebra. Now, you might have a standard that you choose that's not here, and that's fine. Things like time, things like measurement, they may not be listed here, but they still may be very important at your grade level. When I open this, it gives me the information on 4th grade NBT 5 and what it looks like. The fact that it's here tells me of its importance. We're going to go back here for just a minute and go to the next part. If I go onto that standard and to the focus on the bottom, it gives us a very nice report, a table that shows us the most important things all the way from kindergarten through continuum to 8th grade on what would be the big clusters of standards. Well, if I want to verify that I have chosen a standard that is important, it already shows me that using the 4 operations with whole numbers to solve problems, and using place value, understanding, and properties of operations to form multi-digit arithmetic, both of those are listed within their cluster. So I feel pretty confident that I should keep this as one of my standards that I choose. Now, I should choose about 5 to 6 standards. I realize that there's way more priority standards than that, but we can't do a year-long project or a year-long emphasis with all of them. So think about what would be the most important standards that you would want to think about for year-long focus. And odds are there's going to be additional grade level standards that fall underneath them. But let's think about that in the big picture. Once we've identified our 5 to 6 standards, then what we want to do is backmap the prior skills needed in order for a student to be successful on that standard. And to do that, there's also some resources that we can use to help us. When I go to the North Dakota Standards-Based Learning site and click on the standard and 4th grade number and operations NBT 5, it's going to tell me at the level 4, what are some of the most important standards or sub-skills that a student is going to have to know and understand in order to move to a level 5 or a level 4. And it gives me this vocabulary for that. It tells me the basic processes that the student may not be able to do yet, even though they are standards that were out of grade level, or perhaps were taught earlier in the year. What are standards that they need to know and be able to do? If we go back to that coherence mapping, when we're within the coherence map, and it will tell me when I go to my standard, it will list standards that have occurred before mine. So when I click on the NBT 5, and I look at these standards that occur off to the left, it shows me what standards come before the standard that I'm dealing with, and how does it support standard NBT 5. So I might want to look through those standards to see if I agree or if I know that my students are struggling with NBT 5, what are the skills they might be missing in order that I need to think about? Because what we're going to do with this information is we are going to back map it for our reference in order to make our calendar. So if you take a look on the bottom, I've listed the standard 4th grade NBT 5, which is 4-digit times a 1-digit multiplication, 2-digit times a 2-digit multiplication, and also ability to show and justify that my calculations by either using an equation, by using a multiplication rectangular array, or a different model to demonstrate the multiplication. Well, in my 4th grade book that I'm using, this happens to occur in chapter 9. But then I back map what are the other skills that a student needs to know and be able to do prior to being introduced to doing this in chapter 9. Well, you can see that some of the skills that the teacher and I identified occurred in chapter 4. This occurred in chapter 9. These went back to chapter 4. But these two here, the regrouping one place value and multiplication facts, they're out of grade level standards that a student should have already mastered in order to be successful at this skill. And so the teacher made a note that she would use and incorporate these things into her weekly slideshow. So let's take a little bit more deeper look into what this might look like. Now, depending on what grade you teach, I've included some other back mapping. Here's a 1st grade one. You can see how there's a couple 1st grade standards that they feel they need to know and be able to do before they get to this geometry and measurement standard. There's also several kindergarten skills that they should know and be able to do before they get to the 1st grade standard. Similarly, on the 3rd grade one, you can see that the chapters here tell us where they are occurring. But once we get up to here, here are the 4 skills that they need to know and be able to do prior to starting on the grade level material. Again, here's another example of an 8th grade and a high school that leads you through the same process. Here, one of the high school standards goes all the way back to 8th grade. Here at the 8th grade standard, they've identified a couple 7th grade skills that a student needs to know and be able to do. That's what back mapping does. It tells us what are the prerequisite skills that support the skill that we're going to be teaching at a certain time in our year. Now, once we back mapped our skills, and like I said, you want to do maybe 5 to 6, start out with 1 or 2, and then build that as you go. Once we have done that, now we're going to work on drafting a calendar with the approximate dates and activities. We're going to have to reteach some of those out of grade level standards. We're going to have to identify any standards that are at grade level that are going to support the standard that we're focusing on. If we're expecting them to do a grade level standard, then we need to make sure that they've mastered any of the out of grade level or in grade level standards and skills that come before it. Then we have to identify, we need to know about in our scope and sequence when that priority standard will be taught. And then once it is taught to conclusion, we have to have some type of plan. How are we going to continue to assess it? How are we going to make sure that they don't lose it? That rate of forgetting table shows us how that's going to happen if we don't give focus to practicing it. So let's assume that this is our end of instruction after this 3rd repetition that occurs in 7 days. We have to have a plan. So how are we going to revisit it in about a month and again in about 3 months if we truly want the majority of our kids to retain the information? If we are not revisiting it, then we can look at this rate of forgetting line, dashed line that happens. Unfortunately, that's kind of where we're at. We know about 40% of our kids in North Dakota are proficient, which shouldn't surprise us when we look at what the rate of forgetting happens if we are not bringing back and reteaching and practicing any of those skills. And most of our textbooks do not provide that for us. We have to have a plan for what they're going to look like. So how can we make learning stick? Well, here's an example of what a distributed practice and assessment of long-term priority standards might look like. So this red arrow points to the X. The X represents end of class-wide instruction on that standard or skill. Summative assessment has been given that represents the end of learning expectations. Now, once that assessment is given, I have to know who was proficient at that standard and who wasn't proficient at that standard. If they were not proficient at the skill, I have to think, how am I going to provide reteaching for those students that aren't proficient, as well as practice opportunities for all students before I come back and assess that standard again. And remember, we said it needs to go about a month. So these are kind of spaced in that 4 to 6 weeks apart, where I should be coming back and doing a summative recheck for all students on those most important grade level standards that I have identified, and continue practicing opportunities for the students and or reteaching opportunities for those students that did not achieve proficiency. So what might that look like if we look back at our standard for NBT5? So the first thing you notice on the top, at the very beginning of when school starts, the teacher has listed what are the things that she's going to do right at the beginning of the year. Add and subtract, multiplication, and dividing facts. Well, that's listed above. She has a fluency plan in place to continue to practice those multiplication facts. Subtracting with regrouping, multiplying 2-digit by 1-digit, place value. She's going to practice those out of grade level skills, it says, by using a practice review slideshow. She's also going to use flashcards, bell ringer math minutes, and 99 math. Okay, now she put the date as the 27th. I remember she said, well, I'm going to choose the Wednesday in the middle of the week because those are usually days that we don't miss school. She probably, right? She could do it any day during this week, but she's going to dedicate time to practice these out of grade level skills and reteach them for the students. So then as it goes on from there, all students are going to continue to practice. She's going to have small group explicit reteaching and practice with any students that are not able to do 2, 3, and 4 that she listed above. And that's going to continue. When it gets into November, however, is when the book teaches 3-digit by 1-digit modeling and standard algorithm for multiplication. So she's added number 5 to her assessment for the 29th. Now, these other ones supported this. So as we look at this as it goes through September through November, then in the middle, December, January, February, and at the end, March, April, May, she has built on, she's added in there the 2-digit by 2-digit with modeling and standard algorithm that occurred in the book. This is when she expects that to happen, is in December. Number 7, the 4-digit by 1-digit modeling with standard algorithm. That's what this standard expects, is number 6 and number 7. And you can see on her calendar, she has a date or a week identified with how and when I'm going to assess that. And in between each one of those, she's going to do that practicing and reteaching that we talked about earlier. Now, this doesn't have to be a long time, but we do know that we need to practice. In practice, if we don't practice, that's not going to improve. And practice, if we do the wrong type of practice, practice makes permanent. So if we want it to be perfect practice with correct answers, our practice needs to be perfect. When reteaching the standards, don't forget that when they don't remember or don't know how to do something, do a mini version of the gradual release model as you reteach in a small group. But then more importantly, or as important, is to provide retrieval practice. So for the next couple minutes, I'm just going to give you some ideas of what that retrieval practice might look like. One of the ways that teachers have really gravitated towards doing is, it's recommended by Dr. Riccomoni out of retrieval.org, is what could retrieval practice look like? It should be about at least 25 minutes a week, but that could look different. You could have one 25-minute session. You could have 2 10 to 15-minute sessions. You could have one 5-minute session every day the whole week and make it 25 minutes. This example shows us what would it look like if I were to do one retrieval practice for 25 minutes a week, or if I even took this same slideshow and built it into two. So what they did was they had given me a list of all of the things at the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade level that they felt their students weren't sure and didn't remember how to do from year to year. So the 3rd grade identified things like addition and subtraction facts. So they listed that, well, they could do finger wars to practice them. They could do choral response to practice them. When you're doing this, remember there's two parts that you don't want to have. You don't want to have a lot of planning from day to day, and you don't want to have to correct anything. That we already have enough time that we put into those things. So any practice that you think of doing, you also want to be able to give immediate feedback for. So these type of activities allowed the teachers to do this. They 3rd graders are having a lot of trouble telling time and doing elapsed time. So they practice skip counting by 5s and 100s, practice skip counting by 15s. They pulled up a clock on the board that they could spin, and everyone took out the whiteboards. Number one best friend in math classes to a teacher is the whiteboard. All the students participate, all the students can write down their answer. They can show it to you at one time, and you can give immediate feedback before you go on to the next problem. Another quick way to do things is called a brain dump. On their whiteboard, because we had practiced all the ways to make 10, all the ways to make 8, students just took out their whiteboards, they wrote down all the ways to make it. Retrieval practices forces the students' brains to pull out the information, and it should be a little bit of a struggle. That struggle is what helps them make that connection and create those dendrites in the brain, which is going to lead to long-term memory, and that's our goal. They did a sprint routine for their multiplication facts, which took about 8-9 minutes. Then we went to adding and subtracting within 1,000. You don't need to create problems beforehand. Turn to the place in the book that has adding and subtracting problems within 1,000 and choose them, or simply make them up on top of your head. You write the problem down, they work the problem, you check it, and you give it feedback. Each of the slides represents something that they knew their kids were having trouble with. This is the extent of the planning. You should have an hour, maybe 45 minutes planning up front. And as this, you continue to gather information and gather data throughout the year, you add a slide to what it is your class, your grade level that you're teaching needs to practice. And you don't do every slide every time. The goal is to do it at least in 1 month, and then again in about 2 months after initial instruction has occurred. So that's one easy way to practice your retrieval practice, and or to reteach and practice any prerequisite skills that need to be taught prior to when the students get to the grade level activity. You need to know what are the things that they need to know and be able to do. Very much comes from those standards that you create and you'd identify for long-term practice. There's lots of other ways that you can do this. You can do it through games. You can do it through flashcards. You can do it to what we refer to as a 4-box review. At the beginning of class every day or once a week, you have 4 problems that you have written on the boards. The student writes them into the problem boxes themselves, and they are expected to solve them, and then they show you their answers. And if they're wrong, you're able to give immediate feedback before they do another problem just like it. One of the ones that shows on the National Intervention site is one of the very best ways to work with things like computation is called Cover, Copy, and Compare. The link to all of these different games are in the slideshow if that's something that works. They're very appropriate from any grade level with the Cover, Copy, Compare down to kindergarten, up to the more difficult versions of factor game, product game, anything that you can think of that goes to the next level. You can also use your virtual Computer games, computer activities, IXL, ALEC, there's all kinds of them that you can use for reteaching and problem solving. But the one thing you want to remember is your goal is about 25 minutes a week. So consider the amount of time that you have in your class to give to it. Another easy way to do it is what's a distributed mixed review. There's different versions. Most of these are for K through 8. There are some 9th and 10th grade ones down here in the secondary. But what your goal is you're choosing activities that provide distributed review practice of all the different things that you might cover throughout the year. What's nice about some of these, again, you don't have any planning. You shouldn't have correcting. The students do it for a couple minutes during class, and you go over them and correct them together quickly as a review of all the activities that you do. You can use these as part of your formative assessment. You can use them as reteaching. The Saxon test forms, if you've ever used those and still have those on the shelf, it's one of the things that work really well is to use their test forms A and B. Now, these could be something that you could do at the beginning of the period, the first 5 questions. You think about how it would look like in your classroom. But your goal is that you're providing distributed mixed review for your calendar, that they come back a couple times after you have taught them. So to go through the 3 parts that we have talked about, think about that you have to identify standards, 5 to 6 standards that you know that your students need to focus on and is important for them to taking to the next level. The second part is you need to back map the skills for that standard, and then you need to purposely plan to pre-teach the prerequisite skills prior to when they get to that standard, and you have to provide them distributed practice after you get to that standard. Some of the math talks that we have done prior to this will help you think about some of those things if you need more information. So you can go back, all of the skills that are listed on the screen now are math chats that we have held earlier this year and are available in digital form, as well as being able to print the handouts. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps you in your students' achievement. Thank you.